Fellas, today we're going to be discussing some of the biggest missed fight opportunities in the UFC. So fights that would have been bangers, or fights that just would have made so much pay-per-view sales that the UFC didn't capitalize on, or they tried to make it happen, but something happened so that it, couldn't go through. But we're going to be taking a look at the 5 biggest fight opportunities. Some of these have already been booked, some of these haven't been booked, but I'm going to be talking about 5 fights that would have been huge for the UFC that just never really happened. So we're going to start off with number 1. Brock Lesnar versus Daniel Cormier. This fight would have been huge around the 25th, well, whenever Brock Lesnar was ready, because they had that face-off in the octagon, and that would have been the perfect time for this fight to happen. There was beef between them. Obviously, they had the old octagon. I wouldn't say it's like personal beef, but they definitely had like... They're definitely competitive against each other, because there was that whole octagon moment where Brock Lesnar was shoving Daniel Cormier, and they had a few exchanges there. So, it wasn't like they were friendly towards each other. Quite hostile. And they were both good wrestlers. Obviously, Brock Lesnar literally won a UFC belt just by wrestling. Daniel Cormier, I can't speak. Do I even need to explain Daniel Cormier's wrestling? One of the best wrestlers in the UFC, arguably the best wrestler in heavyweight history. So it would have been amazing to see in the grappling side of things. Striking side of things, I'd probably edge it towards Cormier, because Brock Lesnar did look terrible on the feet. But Lesnar was a huge draw. Like, you got to remember, Lesnar was a huge name in the wrestling industry. He's one of the biggest stars in the sport. I'd say Brock Lesnar, of all time, I think I'd put him in the top 10 biggest stars in the sport just because of his WWE background. So he would have drawn so many eyes to this fight. And Daniel Cormier, he would have been able to sell a fight, because Daniel Cormier can sell a fight, especially if it's someone that he doesn't like John Jones or Brock Lesnar. He can sell a fight. So this fight would have been huge as a pay-per-view main event. And it's kind of like the whole WWE versus UFC narrative. The WWE fan base are going to be backing Brock Lesnar. The UFC fan base are going to be backing Daniel Cormier. There's a little bit of a storyline there. The WWE fans are watching. UFC fans are watching. Even boxing fans are going to be watching, because this is a huge fight. Probably the biggest crossover fight in UFC history. This would have been, and by crossover, I mean like from one sport to another. And I know Brock Lesnar at this point already won a belt and everything, but it would have been good to see him face Daniel Cormier. I would have probably gone for Daniel Cormier to win this, because he's one of the best heavyweights of all time. He's double champ. I'd put him in that top 10 greatest of all times. And I just don't see how Brock Lesnar would have been able to beat him. I think Daniel Cormier is better everywhere the fight goes, but on paper, this would have been huge. I don't understand why it didn't happen. It was probably something to do with Brock Lesnar, because he did have a bit of a dodgy UFC career, let's be honest. It wasn't the most, there's issues with steroids and him pulling out of fights. So I think that's probably why it didn't get made. But Brock Lesnar versus Daniel Cormier would have been one of the biggest fights in UFC history, and I'd have loved to see it. Next, we have Tony Ferguson versus Khabib. Now, this was one that's been booked for so many times. This has been booked 5 times, and this would have been so interesting to see. They already had a press conference for this, and unfortunately it didn't go through. But the press conference, I mean, that's one of those press conferences that you want to pay for. It was hilarious. They were both angry with each other. Khabib and Ferguson calling each other bullies, talking about the past. This was prime Tony Ferguson as well. This was Tony Ferguson that was on a 12-fight win streak. This ain't no Tony Ferguson that's been getting mauled in his last 7 fights. This is a Tony Ferguson fresh of a 12-fight win streak. And it would have been great to see him get a title shot against Khabib and actually go through with it. Obviously, they had pullouts, there was issues, there was health issues, Tony Ferguson tripping over a wire. So it seems like this matchup was never meant to be, but I would have loved to see it. Like I said about Ferguson, he was scary at the time. People still think that Tony Ferguson would have been the guy to beat Khabib. He was technically unbreakable. Nobody could break him. His striking was great, and he had great submissions as well. I do think Khabib would have just taken him down and dominated him, but I would have loved to see how Khabib would have fared against a guy like Ferguson off a 12-fight win streak. It would have sold pay-per-views. Probably would have been one of Khabib's biggest fights. I actually think if they went through with this would probably be Khabib's second biggest fight, obviously second to the Mcgregor one, but apart from the Mcgregor one, this would have been a huge fight, and the build-up, like I said, would have been insane. We already got a press conference. Yeah, I'd have loved to see this fight. If Ferguson managed to pull off this, that would have been crazy, but we never got to see it. Prime Tony Ferguson versus Khabib. I wish we managed to see it, to be honest with you, but yeah, it's very unfortunate. But like I said, this was prime Ferguson as well. Prime Tony Ferguson. But yeah, we were robbed of this insane matchup. El Kukui versus the Eagle. Yeah, like I said, I'd probably go with Khabib to win, though, by He'd probably end up getting the referee end up stopping it because, I mean, shortly after this was booked, Gaethje then fought Ferguson and broke him. So I can kind of see Khabib doing the same thing. But at the time, this would have been huge. Anyway, next matchup: Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal. This fight in early 2020 would have probably been one of the biggest fights in UFC history. I might as go as far to say that this would have been the second biggest fight in UFC history ever. Potentially overtaking the Khabib fight, but I'm not going to say it would because obviously the Khabib fight was huge, but this could have potentially been one of the biggest fights in UFC history. I don't know why it didn't happen at 170. McGregor could have made 170 because he fought Donald Cerrone at 170. Masvidal would have 100% taken a McGregor fight over a title shot. Masvidal was, at this point, right, Masvidal was one of the biggest stars in the UFC. At this time, early 2020, Masvidal was in arguably the top 3 biggest stars in the UFC. He'd knocked out Darren Till in his backyard. He got the fastest knockout in UFC history against Ben Askren. And already at that point, he was a star. And then he fights Nate Diaz for the first ever BMF belt. And then he destroys Nate Diaz. He had so much hype behind him. And then at this point, McGregor, he hadn't taken all the losses against Poirier at this point. He hadn't taken all this time off. He did lose to Khabib at this point, and he did lose to Floyd Mayweather, but those were 2 absolutely huge fights. He still had so much momentum at this point. If this fight would have happened, it would have been insane. It would have been a striker versus striker. And at this point, McGregor hadn't really gone on a downfall. And I know he lost to Khabib, but on the feet, he was still kind of Mystic Mac on the feet. He was still kind of, you know, the notorious one on the feet. And I think Masvidal versus McGregor would have been an insane fight. Not only would it had sold, but it would have been entertaining to watch. I'd probably go with Masvidal to win this at the time because Masvidal in 2019 was something else. But I know this was in 2020, but if they just went with McGregor versus Masvidal early 2020, that would have been huge. I don't know why they didn't, because this would have been huge as well, because they trash talked as well. Because I think after the Cerrone fight, McGregor said something about Masvidal. I don't exactly know what he said, but I think he hinted towards Masvidal, calling him a mouthy fool or something. I don't think they would have had the beef to the point. Like I don't think they would have hated each other as much as McGregor and Khabib would have. But it definitely would have been a big fight. Definitely would have been huge, and I would have loved to see this. Like I said, this would have sold pay-per-views because Masvidal can sell a pay-per-view. He literally headlined a pay-per-view without a title fight against Covington. And obviously McGregor's McGregor. If McGregor's on the card, instant 500k pay-per-view buys. But I still think this would have been huge. I don't know why they didn't do it. I would have loved to see this fight at 170, early 2020 instead of the Cerrone fight, because no one wants to see McGregor versus a washed Cerrone. But yeah, I'd probably go Masvidal by 2nd or 3rd round. Actually, no, I don't know, man. Yeah, I'd go with Masvidal to win this, but yeah, this would have been a huge fight in the UFC, one of the biggest, and I don't know why UFC didn't do it. They didn't even book it once. Maybe there was issues, maybe someone was injured, maybe Masvidal did, but Masvidal wouldn't choose to get a title shot over a McGregor fight. Nobody would. Anyway, next up we have GSP versus Anderson Silva. I don't think this was actually booked, but the UFC did plan on making this matchup. It might have been booked, I'm not sure, but this would have literally been the greatest versus the greatest. This is like John Jones versus Demetrius Johnson, obviously at the same weight class though. They're both in the GOAT list. I've got Anderson Silva as the 4th greatest of all time and GSP as the 2nd greatest of all time. Some people think Anderson's above GSP. Some people think GSP's above Anderson. This fight would have genuinely settled it. And I honestly can't pick a winner. GSP probably edges it for the grappling side of things, but he can also strike. Silva edges it for the striking part of things, but he can also grapple. Prime, they were both in their prime when this was getting rumoured. Like prime, they were both in the prime at the same time. Probably would have happened at middleweight, to be honest with you, or maybe a catchweight in between, but this would have sold pay-per-views and this would have been insane. The GOAT conversation will be a lot different because if GSP won this fight, people would without a doubt be putting GSP above Silva, and likewise if Silva won, people would be putting him above GSP. But this, in their primes, this would have been a huge fight. It's literally the greatest versus the greatest. Like, to have 2 people in the GOAT list that are at pretty similar weight classes and to have them fighting in the same era, it was, I don't know why the UFC didn't try and make this fight more than they did. This would have been huge. It would have been an extremely high-level fight. It might have arguably been the highest-level MMA fight in UFC history, as in two of the most two of the greatest at MMA in the history of the sport going at it. We don't get this anymore. We get to see people like Jones and we get to see people like Demetrius Johnson, but their opposition are not on the same level of these of them. Prime GSP and Prime Silva, they were literally the best of the best. It wasn't like their opposition was slightly worse. I genuinely don't know who I'd go for at this point. Maybe I'd go for... I genuinely can't pick. Let me know who you pick for this fight, but I genuinely can't pick. But this would have been huge. This would have sold pay-per-views, and this would have been one of those classics, and probably one of the biggest fights from 2010 to 2020. Probably early 2010s, maybe 2009 even, but we were robbed of this matchup, and even to this day, we're annoyed that we never got to see it, because everyone's GOAT debate, everyone's GOAT list would be a lot easier to make if this fight happened, but it would have been extremely high level, and I'm annoyed we didn't see it. And finally, Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier. It would have just been a classic war. Like, we get wars with Dustin Poirier and Chandler, and, you know, Chandler Gaethje Poirier. But I wish we would have seen Nate Diaz face more people from 155. We got to see him against McGregor twice, but that was really it. Who else did we really see Ferguson against? Not Ferguson. Who else did we really see Diaz? I'm going to change this so you can see it a little bit better. Anyway, who else did we really see Diaz against at 155? We never got to see him against someone like a Gaethje or an Oliveira, or I don't know, any other 155. We never got to a Khabib or anyone like that. Like Ferguson, we got to see him against Ferguson, but that was in 2022 when they were both old and terrible. I mean, look at where they're at in their stages of career now. Nate Diaz just lost to Jake Paul in a boxing match, and Tony Ferguson's on like a 7-fight losing streak now. But I wish we would have seen Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier in around like the 2020 era of UFC. I think we were robbed of this matchup, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Dustin Poirier. It could have been anyone else, but I think this one would have probably had the most hype for a build-up, because they didn't really like each other at this point. Again, there wasn't like huge beef like McGregor and Khabib, but they didn't like each other, so the build-up would have been great. This would have been an insane pay-per-view headliner for a non-title fight. It would have sold pay-per-views. And I can kind of see the fight going similar to Nate versus McGregor too. As in, Poirier wins the first couple of rounds, but then Nate Diaz just dogs him out and manages to get like a submission win in the later rounds. But yeah, this would have been one of the bloodiest fights in UFC history. Nate Diaz would be bleeding everywhere, and then Dustin Poirier would have been getting his blood everywhere. I mean, but look what happened after one round of Poirier versus Chandler. Some people think that this fight would have literally just been Poirier bullying Nate Diaz. But everyone says that. When Nate Diaz goes against someone, everyone's like, oh, he's going to get bullied, he's going to get destroyed. They said that about Leon Edwards, he didn't get bullied. They said that about Jake Paul in the boxing match, that didn't happen. They said about Conor McGregor both times, none of those happened. Nate Diaz has never been bullied in an octagon. The only opportunity I ever saw of Nate Diaz getting bullied was against Khamzat Chimaev in 2022. But apart from that, I don't think Ferguson would just bully him. I mean, Ferguson... I can honestly see Nate Diaz getting a win by submission. I mean, Ferguson's obviously been submitted twice by Khabib and Oliveira, and he's just been knocked out against Justin Gaethje. So I think this fight in around 2020 would have been great, just before Dustin Poirier fought McGregor for the second time. But we were robbed of this matchup. The build-up and the fight would have been insane. But yeah, that is my top 5 list of the biggest missed opportunities in the UFC. Please let me know if I missed any fights out, or you have any fights that you think would have made huge pay-per-view sales. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching.